Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking I think, a really crucial deep dive into Bessel van der Kolk's seminal work, The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma.
Yeah, this is a book that has just fundamentally shifted how medicine, psychiatry, and really society as a whole has to approach human distress.
It really has.
And our mission for this deep dive is to move beyond framing trauma as, just a bad memory or a story you can talk your way through.
Right.
We're analyzing it as an urgent, large-scale biological and systemic public health crisis, one that actually fundamentally alters our human wiring.
And we should be really clear here. This is a systems-level analysis. We're looking at the mechanisms of trauma and recovery rooted in neuroscience. This is not a clinical instruction manual for you, the listener.
Exactly. We need to unpack the core puzzle that the book presents, which is, why does trauma keep dictating behavior, brain function, and even our bodily regulation long, long after the original threat is gone?
And crucially, why is it that when people show the resulting behaviors, the numbness, the explosive rage, the constant, looking over your shoulder,
The hypervigilant.
the hypervigilance, exactly. Why does the world around them, schools, hospitals, courts, so often misread these biological survival mechanisms as, personal flaws?
As moral defects or just a simple lack of willpower?
Yeah, just get over it.
Right, and that distinction, the difference between a biological response and a moral failing, is just seismic. It's scientific proof that so many disruptive behaviors are caused by actual physical changes in the brain.
It's not a metaphor. The brain architecture changes.
To really get the gravity of this, we have to start with the man who built the argument, Bessel van der Kolk, and the origin story of this whole revolution in thinking.
Van der Kolk's early career, it started with this deep curiosity. He was in medical school, and he compares the state of psychiatry to other medical fields.
Right, he talks about the kidneys.
Yes, the kidneys. He was riveted by how miraculous and precise these automatic bodily systems are. The kidneys just silently, perfectly filter waste, reabsorb chemicals, and maintain balance without us ever thinking about it.
Homeostasis.
Perfect homeostasis. And then he gets to his psychiatry rotation, and he's struck by the complete opposite.
How little anyone seemed to know.
Exactly. How little psychiatrists seem to know about the origins and mechanisms of what they were treating. The biology was a black box, which, led to vague diagnoses and sort of generalized treatments.
He famously wondered if we could ever know as much about our brains and our minds as we do about an organ like the kidney.
And that curiosity, it really defined his path, especially when he arrived at the Boston VA clinic in 1978 to work with the Vietnam veterans.
Because their experiences just completely challenged the existing psychiatric rulebook.
They really did. I mean, these men were suffering from these persistent, uncontrollable rages, horrible nightmares, and this profound, paralyzing feeling of being dead inside.
I remember the story he tells about a veteran named Tom. He was so overwhelmed by just the everyday noise of his own family, his kids playing, his wife talking.
He had to leave the house.
Yeah, he'd just storm out of the house to keep from hurting them. His only relief was drinking or taking these incredibly dangerous high-speed motorcycle rides. He was just constantly battling this internal tension.
And the nightmares were central. They weren't just bad dreams. They were visceral, full sensory replays of the ambush where his whole platoon was killed.
So van der Kolk, working under the model at the time, offered him medication to suppress them, treat the symptom.
But Tom came back for his follow-up, and he hadn't touched the pills.
And his reasoning for that is really the critical turning point in all of this.
It is. He said that if the nightmares disappeared, he felt he would have abandoned his friends and their deaths will have been in vain.
Wow.
He needed to be a living memorial to the dead.
So his loyalty to them was more powerful than his own desire to heal.
Exactly. And that revealed something profound. The suffering was, as he put it, much more complex than simply having bad memories. The war hadn't ended for Tom in 1969. He was neurologically stuck in the past. The trauma had become part of his identity, his biology.
And this realization, it just spurred van der Kolk to synthesize findings from 3 revolutionary new disciplines that were just, coming of age then.
Right. You have neuroscience, which was just starting to map the brain. You have developmental psychopathology.
Which is the study of how bad experiences impact early brain development.
And then interpersonal neurobiology, which looks at how our nervous systems literally interact with and influence each other.
And the research that came out of this wasn't just a new model for therapy. It revealed the true scope of the crisis, which is, it's public health emergency scale.
Oh, absolutely. The book pulls together the data, and the numbers are just staggering. 1 in 5 Americans sexually molested as children. 1 in 4 beaten by a parent badly enough to leave a mark.
1 in 3 couples engaging in physical violence.
So trauma isn't some niche issue for soldiers or disaster victims. It is pervasive. It's everywhere.
And if the scale is that large, you have to treat it as a structural problem.
Which brings us to the core thesis of the whole book. Trauma is stored not just as a cognitive memory, a story you can tell, but as a persistent physiological state.
It fundamentally alters brain function, nervous system regulation, and our very awareness of our own bodies.
And this is the part we really have to stress. It produces actual, measurable physiological changes. We're talking about the brain's alarm system being permanently recalibrated to high alert.
An increase in chronic stress hormone activity.
Alterations in how the brain filters information. These are physical changes in the organ of the brain.
And these changes explain why traumatized people become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of, just engaging in their daily lives.
It confirms that those disruptive behaviors we talked about, the rage, the numbing, the failure to learn from experience, they aren't moral defects. They are caused by physical, biological changes in the brain.
They are survival mechanisms that have gone chronic.
Exactly.
That sets the stage perfectly for our deep dive into the core mechanisms. If the body is keeping the score, how exactly does the brain record this trauma and make the past feel so intensely present?
Okay, so let's unpack the mechanisms, because this is where the science gets really fascinating.
We can look right at the brain scans of people having flashbacks, and the findings are stunningly specific.
Traumatic stress literally interferes with the brain's ability to tell the past from the present. It turns memory into an immediate physical experience.
And this comes down to a fundamental imbalance between the emotional brain and the logical executive part of the brain.
Right. During a flashback, the right hemisphere, the emotional, sensory, nonverbal side, is highly activated. It's on fire. But at the same time, a crucial part of the left hemisphere just goes dark.
And that dark part is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC.
Exactly. The DLPFC handles logic, sequencing. It's basically the brain's timekeeper. Its job is to contextualize an event, to put a date stamp on it.
So when the scans show that the DLPFC is deactivated, the person literally loses their sense of location in time.
Yes. The emotional system is screaming, danger, but the brain's highest executive function can't step in and say, hey, this happened in 1971, and you're safe in this room right now.
So the sensory and emotional experience is relived as if it's happening right now. It's timeless.
That is the biological definition of timeless reliving. The trauma isn't being remembered in a narrative sense. It's being re-experienced, unfiltered by logic or the awareness that the threat is over.
And it's not just the timekeeper that shuts down. The medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, is also deactivated.
Which is so important. The MPFC is essential for self-awareness and, critically, for dampening the brain's fear response. It's the watchtower.
The executive commander.
Yes. When it's out of commission, the system is running without a supervisor to organize or inhibit those hardwired automatic emotional reactions.
You lose the ability to reflect on what you're feeling, that little bit of psychological distance you need to say, okay, I am feeling rage, but I don't have to act on it.
That's gone. We see this play out so vividly in the clinical examples, like the story of the couple, Stan and Ute Lawrence, who were in that huge car pileup.
Right. When Stan was scanned while reliving the accident, his brain showed that deactivation of the DLPFC in the thalamus. Biologically, he lost the capacity to know the event was over.
And that leads directly to the nature of the memory itself, which is fragmented and sensory, not verbal. And the thalamus, which you just mentioned, plays a huge role here.
Can you explain the thalamus's function again? The analogy in the book is so helpful.
Of course. The thalamus is like the brain's cook or its chief integrator. It's the central relay station. It collects every raw sensory input sites, sounds, smells, physical sensations, emotions, and it integrates them into one cohesive story.
A memory.
An autobiographical memory. But when overwhelming trauma hits,
the cook shuts down.
The cook shuts down. The integration process breaks down completely. So instead of storing the trauma as a coherent story, I was in a car, there was a crash, I got out, it's stored as isolated, undigested sensory imprints.
Just raw data.
Raw data. A specific smell. The sound of shattering glass, a flash of light, or just that internal feeling of absolute terror and helplessness.
So if the memory is wordless and stored in these raw sensory fragments, then just talking about it isn't enough to heal. The goal of recovery has to be different.
It has to be. Trauma survivors are often instantly hijacked by a specific cue in their environment, a tone of voice, a smell, a sudden touch. It activates these fragments and brings the full emotional and physical force of the past right into the present.
So healing requires association and integration.
Yes, getting those fragmented pieces to come together and be filed away properly as past events, not just trying to desensitize yourself to the pain.
This sensory chaos, it explains why those protective survival responses, fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, become chronic states. The body stays organized for survival even when there's no threat.
And it's chemically maintained by what he calls stress hormone overdrive.
Okay, so in a healthy stress response, you get a rush of adrenaline and cortisol to mobilize you, and then you quickly return to baseline.
Right, homeostasis. But in traumatized people, that system fails to rebalance. The stress hormones linger way longer, and they spike disproportionately in response to even minor stressors.
And this constant chemical bath of stress hormones doesn't just make them irritable, it contributes to long-term health problems.
Huge problems. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, autoimmune diseases, chronic sleep disorders. The body is just constantly exhausting itself preparing for a war that isn't happening.
To understand the different modes of this chronic survival, we have to look at the polyvagal theory.
Yes, from Stephen Porges. This theory is brilliant. It explains that our nervous system has three primary hierarchical states it operates from, depending on how safe we feel.
Let's walk through that hierarchy, starting at the top with the system that depends on feeling safe.
That is the ventral vagal complex, or VVC, the social engagement system. This is the state where we feel secure enough to connect with others. It regulates our facial muscles, gives us a modulated voice, lets us make eye contact.
When the VVC is active, our whole system is flexible and in sync. We can breathe deeply, our digestion works, we're open to connection.
It's the optimal state for healing and growth.
Yeah.
But if that sense of safety fails,
The body reverts to an older system.
it drops down to the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, which activates fight or flight. That's the panic and rage response.
Yeah.
Blood rushes to your limbs, heart rate shoots up, and you're mobilized for immediate, intense action.
And as we mentioned earlier, for many survivors, being in that state, even if it's destructive, can feel like a relief compared to the alternative.
It's that paradoxical preference for action over paralysis. Activating the SNS, even with explosive rage, gives you a temporary, energized feeling that fights off the terrifying helplessness and numbness of shutdown.
It's an attempt to regain agency, even if it's chaotic.
But when that mobilization fails, when you can't fight or run, the system executes its ultimate, most ancient emergency shutdown.
The dorsal vagal complex, the DVC, the reptile brain's response.
Exactly. Freeze or collapse. This is triggered when escape is thwarted, when you're trapped, held down, immobilized. The body drastically reduces metabolism, heart rate plunges, breathing becomes shallow.
So immobilization, that feeling of being physically unable to complete the fight or flight response, is absolutely central to the deepest, most lasting trauma.
It is. When the DVC takes over, the body is essentially playing dead. It leads to severe physical symptoms like chronic gut issues and, most crucially, psychological dissociation. The mind escapes the body.
The survivor feels alienated, disconnected, like they have no body.
And if the nervous system never fully recovers from that DVC shutdown, the person can live in a chronic state of low-level numbness, depression, and profound disconnection.
So if these chronic survival states are stored so physically, so biologically, it becomes crystal clear why top-down treatments like just talk therapy or medication often hit a wall.
They do. Talk therapy and meds, they target the cognitive mind, the DLPFC, and try to dampen symptoms. But they really struggle to alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses stored deep in the body, that hyperactive smoke detector, the amygdala.
You can talk about the trauma for years, but if your body is still physically preparing for a predator, you haven't healed.
Exactly. So healing requires a different approach. It has to restore these fundamental biological functions. Bodily regulation, agency, that feeling of being in charge of your own life and presence.
Being firmly rooted in the present.
Both physically and emotionally, yes. This is what he calls limbic system therapy, accessing the emotional brain to repair those faulty alarm systems. And it often requires bottom-up physical experiences that directly contradict the original feeling of helplessness or collapse.
Can you give an example of what that looks like?
Sure. If the trauma involved being unable to move, Healing might involve, in a very safe and controlled environment, physically experiencing fighting back or running away.
So the body learns, without words, that it has options now.
That's it. This is where methods that include movement, touch, and physical action are just paramount. And central to all of this is restoring body awareness, or what's called interoception.
Right. Interoception, the ability to sense your internal body feelings, is the foundation of emotional awareness. If you can't feel what's happening inside you, you can't gain mastery over it.
And so many trauma survivors suffer from alexithymia, the inability to sense, recognize, or even communicate their internal feelings.
If you can't connect with your gut feelings, your inner compass is broken. You can't confidently say, this is what I think and feel, because the internal data stream is just corrupted.
And it's corrupted because the brain areas for self-sensing, particularly the insula, are impaired. Your whole focus shifts to just suppressing the inner chaos rather than spontaneously engaging with life.
That is the biological lock on freedom and choice.
It is.
Okay, so now we have to zoom out and look at how our human systems, medical, educational, judicial lecture, have historically responded to this biological truth.
And the institutional response has largely been one of denial and misdiagnosis. It's been adapted for bureaucratic and, frankly, financial convenience.
The pattern of denial goes way back. We saw it with the military and war trauma in the 1970s. The system was structured to recognize a physical injury, not the invisible biological scars of conflict.
Right. Veterans like Tom were just misdiagnosed as alcoholics, depressives, even schizophrenics because their complex symptoms didn't fit neatly into the existing checkboxes.
And the VA rejecting Vanderkolk's early grant proposal, stating that PTSD was irrelevant to the mission, that's the quintessential example of this institutional resistance.
Of course it was irrelevant, because accepting the diagnosis would require a massive, costly retooling of the entire system of care.
It was just cheaper and bureaucratically simpler to treat the symptoms as generalized mental illness. Even when the PTSD diagnosis was finally created in 1980, it was limited.
Very limited. It focused on single, big events, not the pervasive, complex trauma from long-term abuse.
Which became even more obvious when the focus shifted to chronic relational trauma, especially child abuse.
The standard psychiatric textbook in 1974 claimed incest was extremely rare, 1 in 1.1 million, and even suggested it might have possible benefits.
That number wasn't just inaccurate, it was a societal lie.
It shows a deep-seated institutional need to look away from what happens in the home. If you acknowledge that trauma is happening constantly inside the family, the whole social contract is threatened. So the system pathologizes the victim later in life instead of confronting the source.
This denial just continued when research started connecting severe childhood abuse to the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yeah, research in the 80s and 90s showed that an overwhelming 81% of patients diagnosed with BPD had severe histories of childhood abuse or neglect, often starting before they were 7.
And BPD, with its unstable relationships, extreme mood swings, self-destructive behavior, it was treated as a fundamental personality defect.
But seeing those symptoms as the long-term biological effects of early brutalization, as a complex adaptation to trauma, that's a complete paradigm shift.
Okay, so if the vast majority of BPD diagnoses are fundamentally rooted in trauma, why did the institutional system, especially the DSM, fail to recognize the criteria for developmental trauma disorder, or DTD, when it was proposed? That seems like a massive systemic failure.
It was, and the resistance came from a few powerful places. First, ideology. BPD is entrenched, and changing the diagnostic manual is a monumental task.
And second, financial incentives.
Big time. The whole movement in psychiatry toward a brain disease model favored efficient drug regimens, better living through chemistry.
Drug protocols are much easier to measure, to bill for, and to manage than complex multi-year body-based therapies.
Precisely. DTD would demand holistic, specialized, trauma-informed care for every child and adult who fit the criteria. That's expensive and complicated. Sticking with BPD allows the system to focus on symptom suppression with medication.
Which often leads to long-term dependence.
Yes. The analogy of treating trauma survivors like kidney patients on dialysis is perfect. It focuses on managing a permanent disability rather than healing the root cause. It's an effective business model, but it's a failure of care.
And this creates a devastating feedback loop of misinterpretation.
It does. The traumatized person who's experiencing intense internal dysregulation, say, chronic stomach cramps, might find that doctors respond much better when they present a physical symptom rather than vague psychological distress.
So they learn to translate their stress into a physical ailment. The system, in turn, adapts to the symptom, orders x-rays, and reinforces the idea that the physical problem is the main issue.
And at the same time, their desperate coping mechanisms, the rage, the self-mutilation, which started as survival strategies, they get classified by institutions as permanent disabilities or moral defects.
Which just reinforces the shame and alienation that drives the dysregulation in the first place.
It's a closed loop.
So if the problem is this systemic and this biological, the implications for how we structure everything, from healthcare to education, are enormous. Let's pivot to those present-day implications, starting with mental health treatment models.
Given the embodied nature of trauma, treatment models have to be truly multifaceted. They have to actively rewire the brain.
And since language struggles to alter those automatic physical responses, effective approaches have to access the deeper emotional and body-based parts of the brain.
This is why therapies that engage both mind and body, like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, somatic therapies, and neurofeedback, have become so indispensable.
They work bottom up.
Exactly. EMDR, for instance, uses bilateral stimulation to engage both brain hemispheres, helping the brain's timekeeper, the DLPFC, integrate those fragmented memories into a coherent story that gets file under past.
And somatic therapies help the body complete the defensive action that got thwarted,
allowing that fight or flight energy to finally discharge safely.
We also mention a measurable biomarker for this dysregulation, low heart rate variability, or HRV.
Yes, HRV is a critical diagnostic tool. It measures the variation in time between your heartbeats, and it reflects the flexibility of your autonomic nervous system. Low HRV means the system is rigid, stuck in high alert, or collapse.
The gas and the brake pedals are out of sync.
Perfectly put. A healthy system has high HRV. It can respond to stress and then quickly return to baseline. A traumatized system is rigid.
So effective interventions have to specifically restore that balance.
Which is why body-focused practices, yoga, deep breathing, rhythmic movement, dance, martial arts, are not just secondary self-care. They are core physiological regulatory tools. They send powerful, nonverbal signals of safety directly to the brainstem.
Okay, moving to education. The Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study, gave us incontrovertible evidence of how early trauma disrupts not just mental health, but core academic and social functioning.
IACE scores correlate directly with higher rates of behavioral and learning problems in school, and then later, profoundly higher rates of workplace absenteeism and financial instability in adulthood. It's a devastating developmental disruptor.
So a child who grows up in chronic danger learns to interpret any change, any shift in tone, as a threat. Their nervous system is organized for survival, not for quiet attention in a classroom.
And the system's typical response? Verbal reprimands, timeouts, suspension, it's structurally ineffective.
Because it fails to recognize that the defiant behaviors are often frustrated attempts to communicate distress. The child is reacting biologically, not willfully defying authority.
The policy implication is enormous.
Yeah.
We have to stop cutting funding for programs that restore regulation and joyful engagement.
Right. Things like chorus, physical education, music, theater, and, yes, recess.
They are vital tools. They foster cooperation, reciprocity, rhythmic movement. Since they help the child organize their perception of danger, they are trauma recovery mechanisms disguised as extracurriculars.
Finally, let's look at the intersection of trauma and the criminal justice system. This is arguably the system most prone to misreading biological dysregulation as moral culpability.
Oh, absolutely. Trauma profoundly affects the capacity for attention, learning, and self-control. The QEE scans showed that traumatized brains struggle to filter out irrelevant information. Their whole information processing architecture is poorly defined.
So they literally struggle to attend to the present moment and learn from experience. And if you add the alexithymia we discussed, the inability to read internal distress signals, it leads to a tragic lack of self-protection.
That lack of self-sensing contributes directly to the high rates of re-victimization. If you can't feel your body signaling danger, you can't set boundaries or remove yourself from risky situations, the trauma just perpetuates itself.
And this has to inform how we interpret antisocial or criminal behavior. We have to recognize that many of these behaviors, like explosive rage, often started as desperate survival strategies.
The body mobilizing the fight or flight system because the alternative, that dorsal vagal collapse, feels too terrifying, like death. When the body is stuck in that state, The capacity for rational executive decision-making is severely compromised.
So we're dealing with a complex adaptation to trauma, not inherent criminality.
We have to pivot from judging the outcome to addressing the cause.
And on a broader public health scale, we have to address trauma not as an individual problem, but as a core health crisis.
The data is stark. Since 2001, far more Americans have died at the hands of family members or partners than in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined.
American women are twice as likely to suffer domestic violence as they are to get breast cancer.
Yet the resource allocation just doesn't reflect that reality at all. The national effort for diseases like cancer completely dwarfs the effort dedicated to addressing the predictable consequences of trauma.
The knowledge exists to prevent and treat this effectively, but the structural focus is just profoundly misplaced. We're willing to invest heavily in managing the end-stage diseases that often result from trauma, but not in treating the trauma itself.
Which brings us to our broader themes here at Crisis and Perception. This book offers such powerful insights into how biology constrains human freedom and choice.
We often assume people have full cognitive autonomy, but the physiological imprint of trauma proves that's not always the case.
The persistence of stress hormones, the chronic activation of defense systems, it creates a biological trap. The survivor is imprisoned in a matrix of fear, isolation, and scarcity. Their inner compass is shut down.
So it's literally impossible for them to spontaneously try new options, even when those opportunities are logically available. Their animal brain is stuck in a fight for survival.
Which severely reduces their capacity for complex thought, for planning, for connection, the highest levels of human freedom. Their choices are biologically limited.
This leads right to the conclusion that perception cannot be separated from our bodily state. Vanderkolk emphasizes that the experience of safety is a physiological state. It's built on a foundation of feeling internally regulated.
And that alexithymia, the inability to observe your own visceral sensations, is profound disconnection of mind and body. It makes it impossible to achieve a robust sense of self. How can you say, this is who I am and what I want, if you can't trust the data from your own body?
And perception itself is physically altered. The brain struggles to filter stimuli, so the world feels constantly noisy and threatening. People become hyper-responsive to sound and light. It's a brain on guard, keeping them imprisoned in the past.
And this physiological reality explains that core systemic misreading. How institutions confuse trauma symptoms with moral failure. By failing to understand the neurological roots of rage or collapse, society defaults to judgment, which just perpetuates the survivor's shame.
The lack of a trauma-specific diagnosis like developmental trauma disorder forces systems to view these complex behaviors through a lens of individual pathology, a broken person.
Instead of seeing them for what they are, a complex adaptation to trauma. A statement about a biological system functioning under impossible constraints.
If we were to fully integrate the biological truth of trauma, our systems, prisons, schools, hospitals would have to fundamentally reorganize, treating safety and regulation as primary goals.
So to synthesize this whole deep dive, we've confirmed that processing trauma requires so much more than cognitive understanding, more than just telling the story.
The physical experience, the overwhelming emotion, and fragmented sensations, they have to be integrated. Language is vital, but recovery requires restoring safety and self-mastery by addressing the body's stored, wordless memories.
When the body learns, viscerally, that the danger has passed through movement, rhythm, breath, the brain's internal systems can finally realign. Agency and the capacity for spontaneous, joyful engagement with life can return.
And critically, recovery is profoundly relational. It's not just an individual journey. It draws on our human wellsprings of cooperation and reciprocity, things that are essential for turning off the defensive system and fostering connection.
Which is what the social engagement system, the VVC, needs to thrive.
So here's our final reflection for you to consider. We now have the knowledge, the science, the clinical data to prevent and treat trauma effectively on a massive scale. And if major societal advances have historically grown out of collective trauma, like the GI Bill after World War II, how can we, as a society now recognizing our own pervasive trauma, use this understanding of the body and brain to commit to real structural healing, rather than just punishing or medicating the symptoms of our deepest wounds?
A huge question to reflect on.
We credit Bessel van der Kolk, MD, for his research and his pivotal book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma.
We strongly encourage you to seek out and read the book or borrow it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.